why they ran away.
Her daughter spoke of days of fear.
She stayed in my room and constantly crying. She was frightened.
One of the local commanders here told me he expects to be fighting in this city for weeks. Almost 5,000 men are tied down here. This was not in the plan. James Mates, ITV News.
Respite from the dirty business of war. Men who spent 2 days dug into British positions outside Basra hand over to the next platoon. No one anticipated they'd still be stuck several miles from the city centre 4 days after the battle for this southern port began. They're trying to limit civilian casualties, but it's getting increasingly difficult to ensure they're only hitting military targets.
They're all firing wearing civilian clothes, and they're firing under the white flag in it as well, which creates a lot of confusion for us. So at the end of the day, I mean, if anybody's looking suspicious or anything, they're getting it, they end up getting it.
In Basra, they're stockpiling scarce supplies. Last night, a massive bomb flattened the Ba'ath Party headquarters. But talk of a popular uprising seems premature. Most are preparing for an indefinite siege. Their fate lies in the hands of commanding officers like Lieutenant Colonel David Patterson, who knows questions are being asked about why the breakthrough's taking so long.
Clearly we have to wait for any operation until the conditions are right to do that operation. And clearly we want to minimise collateral damage, and we want to minimise civilian casualties. And so that's really been what we've been about over the past few days.
The long wait has caught everyone off guard. American convoys are trying to get more ammunition and essential stores to Marines closing in on the south of the city. The coming hours will be critical. These British troops circling Basra, but still several miles away, must decide how long they can wait before launching their final attack. If they delay too long, the people of Basra may feel abandoned. If they go too soon, it could cause unnecessary casualties. The waiting goes on. British soldiers may have Basra in their sights, but they're not yet confident enough to make the final push. Juliet, Bremner, ITV News, near Basra, southern Iraq.
Well, I understand that about 12:30 this afternoon, a large column, as you say, of between 70 and 120 vehicles, mostly armoured personnel carriers and tanks, was seen leaving Basra southeast along the coast road towards the Al Faw Peninsula. This was confirmed by British radar. Warplanes were sent up, US warplanes, and they have, as I understand it, spent the last few hours engaging and attacking those vehicles. That column, the latest information is that it has split up and that many vehicles in the column have been hit.
Okay, Bill Neely there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the video phone. Now the search goes on inside Basra for our cameraman Fred Nearak and our translator Hussein Osman. They've been missing since coming under attack from suspected American friendly fire on Saturday morning. Our correspondent Terry Lloyd was killed in the attack, though despite our best efforts, the condition and whereabouts of Fred and Hussein are still unknown. The first of the aid convoys destined for the people of Iraq crossed the border near here earlier today. There were chaotic scenes when it reached the village of Safwan. Fighting almost broke out as people scrambled to get their hands on aid parcels. Further supplies are on their way, and the Navy supply ship Sir Galahad, which has tons of water, food and medicines on board, is expected to dock very near here at Qasr tomorrow. Chilling evidence emerged today of how Saddam Hussein's army is using schools and hospitals to hide weapons. The port of Qasr is now under the control of Royal Marines, but it's littered with the abandoned weapons of the Iraqi army. Some soldiers who tried to mingle with the civilians were discovered and arrested by the Marines. Here's Bill Neely again.
Saddam Hussein defended Qasr with 120 men. Today, the Royal Marines began the search for them, their weapons, and the secret police who ruled this town. They targeted half a dozen houses, tipped off by locals who for years have been the victims of violence and repression. The Marines made arrests and slowly the weapons were uncovered. These aging grenade launchers were in an ambush trench. But it was Iraqi children who led us to the biggest find in the Father Firas Primary School. We found 3 classrooms packed with hundreds of hand grenades, rocket-propelled grenades and discarded uniforms. The Iraqi troops had disappeared into the civilian population. Saddam is the national role model for these children, but their education comes second to the weapons he hides in their schools, hospitals, even mosques. Outside, rocket-propelled grenades lie in the school playground. The searches continue, but it's pretty clear Saddam's troops and secret police fled north to Basra a few days ago. But the people here still don't feel safe. The state of terror that is Iraq under Saddam won't disappear as quickly as his troops. As the house-to-house searches intensified, an informer told Marines where to find 4 Iraqi soldiers. He described them as a colonel, 2 captains and a major. The Marines took them away for questioning. But what these locals want most now is water, food and medicine.
We need peace and nothing.
Do you need Saddam Hussein?
Huh? This is a question I can't answer for you.
But there are still pockets of support for Saddam Hussein in Qasr.
This war, American and British people lose the war.
Will lose the war?
Yeah.
Why?
You lose the war.
The battle for Qasr may be over. The battle for the hearts and minds of all the people of Iraq is only just beginning. Bill Neely, ITV News with the Royal Marines in Qasr.
Night after night, the US Air Force is pounding targets in and around the city of Mosul. Anti-aircraft fire rises from the Iraqi guns in front of us, but it is weak and ineffective. American planes are now bombing in daylight too. Today, 4 bombs hit the ridgeline where the Iraqis are dug in. From our side, Kurdish soldiers looked on eagerly, but it seems that the bombs missed their targets, and soon afterwards, the Iraqis were walking around in full view. The bombing is being coordinated by teams of American and British Special Forces soldiers who travel in 4-wheel drives guarded by Kurdish troops. The US Marine General, who is now in effective command of the Northern Front, today met with Kurdish and ethnic Turkish representatives. His efforts have been boosted by Turkey's reported decision not to send its troops into northern Iraq, a move that could have started a separate shooting war between Turks and Kurds.
Our role here is to work with all the groups in northern Iraq to help them succeed in overthrowing the Saddam regime.
The Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers who went north to confront the Turks can now turn south to confront Saddam. There's talk of a deal allowing the Kurds to advance, but not to take control of Iraqi cities.
As in the rest of Iraq, appalling weather conditions have been hampering military operations here. But American bombing is gradually intensifying, and some sort of move to take on the Iraqi positions at the other end of this bridge and in the hills beyond would seem to be on the cards. Julian Mannion, ITV News, on the main road to Mosul.
Waiting for orders, because they might be cut off from communication and infrastructure. A few minutes later, the TV building was hit, and the news went off the air. It came back again this morning with a weaker signal. The Iraqis were clearly expecting the strike and may have alternative means of broadcasting.
In Iraq, actually, not Kuwait any longer, I'm gratified to say. Yes, that news tonight. An armoured column believed to be coming southeast out of Basra, heading down the Al-Faw Peninsula. This is a manoeuvre that the Iraqis have tried before during the recent days of this campaign. And I have to say, given the overwhelming forces ranged against them, it does look like a form of, frankly, of mechanised suicide. Airstrikes already, I'm told, being called into to try and deal with that, although of course, military reporting restrictions circumscribe how much I can say about that. But a little more from the southern front in a moment or two. But let's move a little further north to Nasiriyah, further north and west from where I'm standing now. This is, of course, a key centre on the great sweep north by American forces up through Iraq towards Baghdad. Well, our ITN colleague James Mates is in Nasiriyah, which has seen some fierce fighting and counter-attacking from Iraqi forces against the Americans.
For 24 hours, US Marines sat out a paralysing dust storm that fouled machinery and paralysed operations. Then came the rain that turned the desert to a sea of mud. Vehicles stranded, young Marines forced to spend the last 36 hours outdoors in these conditions and then be ready for battle. It is, of course, much too early to talk of US forces being bogged down here, but this was not how a lightning desert war was supposed to look. And the battle for Nasiriyah is not close to being over. A corridor has been cut through the city, allowing men and supplies north to Baghdad, and elsewhere it is an ugly guerrilla war.
For 4 days now, they have been taking incoming fire from this group of buildings you can see through the mist there. It was once a hospital, it is now an Iraqi command center. The Marines have finally lost patience with it and are determined to destroy it with mortar and artillery fire.
And when the barrage ended, the Marines moved in, finally to eradicate this thorn in their side. The mud, the tropical mist, the palm trees, eerily reminiscent of another of America's great conflicts. Dozens of Iraqis have been surrendering, all in civilian clothing, almost all young men, suggesting they are deserters rather than refugees. One family did get out. Ali, with her 18-year-old son and 12-year-old daughter, broke through the battle lines this morning.
Well, she's saying a lot of civilians got killed in the bombardment, and that's why they ran away.
Her daughter spoke of days of fear.
She stayed in my room and constantly crying. She was frightened.
One of the local commanders here told me he expects to be fighting in this city for weeks. Almost 5,000 men are tied down here. This was not in the plan.
Preparing to fight. These ones, shown by state television, are said to be in southern Iraq. Outside Najaf, though, intelligence reports say as many as 1,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed after running into US forces. British troops say they are maintaining pressure on the town of Zubair, where a Ba'ath Party member was seized in a raid.
There's a Ba'ath Party headquarters in Al-Zubair. Yesterday we hit it and pulled out a senior politician. Today we targeted it with air and with ground troops and have effectively razed it to the ground, thereby eliminating the political process and indeed the base from which many of the irregulars are operating out of in that area.
But there have been further coalition losses. Al Jazeera showed pictures of what appeared to be a downed surveillance drone and an upturned British Army Land Rover. It also displayed what it said were 2 captured coalition soldiers and the pictures of 2 bodies said to be those of British servicemen. They are too distressing for broadcast.
Ring the bell.
In the relatively secure town of Qasr, Royal Marines are making their way through houses one by one. They're looking for weapons and the Iraqi soldiers who fired them. They may be long gone. They may not be. Every potential source of conflict is checked, not always tactfully.
We're calling it Firebase Mars. The dust and sand which have filled the air for much of the last 48 hours turn everything a reddish orange in the late afternoon. It also provides cover for Iraqi troops wanting to strike back at the US invasion force. It's thought some may be doing so in civilian clothes.
It makes it more difficult to continue our mission because we don't want to make sure we don't harm any non-combatants. When they bring that type of threat into the fold, that increases the chance of non-combatants being hurt because now soldiers are more in heightened alert.
Overnight, the dust had mixed with rain and everything received a muddy respray. Soldiers awoke to the news of one of the biggest engagements of the war so far. A group of lightly armed Iraqis, believed here to be Ba'ath Party loyalists, had travelled out from nearby Najaf, probably looking for US forces to attack. In the sandstorm, they ran into the wrong ones. Men like these, a battalion of the 7th Cavalry in Bradley armoured fighting vehicles and M1 tanks. It was a desperately one-sided fight. Several hundred Iraqis believed killed, no American casualties. But the harsh weather makes no difference to the missile launchers of the American artillery. The crews are working, eating and sleeping in the launcher cabins.
Definitely test your crew's likeness of one another. You know, all those little temperaments come out, but we get along great, so.
Today came a reminder, though, of the ever-present danger.
At about 3 o'clock this afternoon, one of the soldiers ran out of the command centre shouting, "Incoming, incoming." We all ran and took cover in the foxholes around the perimeter of the camp. It was a false alarm, but tonight each foxhole is being dug that little bit deeper.
Also tonight, intelligence reached Firebase Mars of a large Iraqi force heading south. More large-scale engagements are expected in the coming hours. Carl Dinnan, Channel 4 News, Central Iraq.
The first aid convoy into Iraq since the American-led invasion. The UN demilitarized zone on the border is no more. Signs banning US military overtaken by events. Much of this convoy contained safe drinking water destined for Qasr close by, the first town of any significance to fall to the invaders. This is what the British have always stressed is the military imperative, to get Qasr clear and secure, and then to get to Basra too, to allow them to deliver humanitarian aid. Well, the first part of that really does seem to be underway today as this convoy approaches the border with southern Iraq. The latter part, the movement into Basra, well, that's still some way off by the look of it.
The Iraqi forces, throughout the day, there have been some reports of Iraqi army units and soldiers coming out of Basra and being attacked by the British, and other reports of Iraqi soldiers coming out to surrender. Nevertheless, there are continuing artillery duels between the British and the Iraqis around Basra. Further south in Zubair, the British went in not only to take out pockets of Iraqi resistance and to destroy the Ba'ath Party headquarters, but also to try to deliver aid. There are reports the British came under fire and returned fire at the time they were trying to deliver aid. Reuters also saying that some people there appear so short of water that they're digging in the rain puddles to collect whatever they can, and at one point they hacked through a water pipe and rushed to collect all the water that was gushing from that pipe. Again, further south in the town of Safwan, the first elements of humanitarian aid were delivered, and again there were chaotic scenes as people who were both hungry and thirsty rushed to the trucks to scramble and get whatever they could. The first elements of humanitarian aid were also delivered to Qasr, the port city. That came from stockpiles in Kuwait and was driven in. Back to you.
Commanders with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, who we are embedded with, say that, yes, they have had a problem with guerrilla tactics that have been employed against the supply lines that stretch all the way down into northern Kuwait. Everything is coming up from there. That includes the fuel, that includes the ammunition, that includes the food, and, of course, the personnel and equipment. Yesterday, for the 1st Marine Division, it was fuel that was critical. In fact, so much so they had to put a pause in operations as far as moving forward because they were running so short of fuel. Last night, a mission came through. They are talking about 250,000 gallons of diesel fuel that needed to come up and come into this region. The problem is there are paramilitary units, according to U.S. commanders here, known as the FEDAYEEN, that have been launching hit-and-run tactics against the supply line. That's bad enough, but imagine if they hit the fuel tankers. Not only is that a critical supply that's needed, but the explosive force of fuel tankers going up would be devastating. So the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines in this area was given the job, make sure that the FEDAYEEN did not get to those critical fuel tankers that were coming in. All night long, it was a running battle that took place along the supply line. You had U.S. Marines in armored vehicles and in Humvees working in almost complete darkness, firing against opposing forces that were firing in. gunshots ringing out in the middle of the night, RPGs lacing their way across the roadway, and then the return fire from the U.S. Marines trying to suppress, as they say, the fire that was coming towards the convoy. But it was pitch dark. There was confusion. For many Marines, this was their first time really in combat. You have vehicles working in extremely difficult terrain, marshland, deep trenches, and in many cases just rivers and backwaters. The armored vehicle that we were riding in ran into a Humvee. Then, a short time later, another armored vehicle slammed into the side of us. And then even later after that, our armored vehicle ran into a house. Fortunately, nobody was home. But it shows you the difficult conditions combined with the guerrilla tactics that the Marines are up against here. When daylight showed itself here, finally, there were at least 3 of the armored vehicles that were upended in ditches and trenches. But for the U.S. Marines, the most important fact is this: the fuel got through, which now means the Marines can continue to move north. Martin Savage, CNN, Southern Iraq.
Men stands between the coalition and one of its key objectives, Baghdad. Coalition forces have already flown thousands of bombing runs over the Iraqi capital to try to weaken the 3 Republican Guard divisions that surround the city. The Medina Division, one of the most battle-hardened units of the Guard, is at the tip of the Iraqi sword, south of Baghdad. On Monday, U.S. forces say they ran into a wall of gunfire while engaging Iraqi soldiers in an area where U.S. officials believe elements of the Medina Division to be located. The U.S. suffered losses, an Apache helicopter was shot down, 2 crew members were taken prisoner, and several helicopters were damaged. U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld says the fight will get harder as the 2 forces draw closer.
This campaign could well grow more dangerous in the coming days and weeks as coalition forces close on Baghdad, and the regime is faced with its certain death.
The 2 armies have met before. During the 1991 Persian Gulf War, the 1st U.S. Armored Division was embroiled in a fierce battle with the Republican Guard.
They wouldn't stop fighting. U.S. forces would blow up their armored personnel carrier, and you'd have 2 or 3 charred Iraqis fall out of the back of it and start firing at the U.S. tanks with machine guns, RPGs, whatever they could.
One of the motivating forces behind the Republican Guard's tenacity is their loyalty to Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Many soldiers come from his birthplace, the town of Tikrit. Others have close tribal ties to members of the Sunni Iraqi leadership. This kinship earns them a special place in the Iraqi army.
The Republican Guards are actually the elite of the Iraqi forces. These are the forces that receive the top care from the Iraqi regime. They are the protectors of the Iraqi regime.
The Republican Guard receives the best pay, equipment, and training of the Iraqi army, and because of this special status, considers itself an army of professionals and has no draftees in its ranks. In the next few days, the Republican Guard's loyalty and fighting skills is expected to be put to the test once again as coalition forces push closer to Baghdad.
A casualty of a new kind of war, killed along with his father as their vehicle approached a Marine checkpoint at high speed. The man, Marines say, was an armed combatant. Marines say they want to avoid killing civilians, but they pose a threat, commanders say, because Iraqi paramilitary groups recruit them to run scouting missions in U.S.-controlled territory, often accompanied by young children.
Some of them have told us that they've been told you need to fight. If you don't fight, we'll do something to your family.
The danger, U.S. military officials say, is that paramilitary groups are conducting guerrilla-style warfare against U.S. positions.
I mean, we expect that, and we're ready for that. And they may want to train, and they're very well trained in guerrilla warfare. But we're very well trained in anti-guerrilla warfare as well. And we'll, if they want to come at us with that, we'll be waiting for them.
When possible, suspects are cuffed and taken in for questioning, or sometimes civilians are simply sent back from where they come from.
All right, no entry, road closed on this one.
And to minimize as much as possible contact between civilians and U.S. Marines, the military is putting up signs in Arabic warning the local population to stay away and remain in their homes.
Marines say they do not know how many civilians may have been killed so far, but they say they were surprised to see women and children in the streets of Nasiriyah while the fighting was raging on. Clearly, said one commander, there is somebody among the Iraqis who is not concerned about the well-being of innocent civilians. Alessio Vinci, CNN, with the U.S. Marines in Nasiriyah.
Honored to be the Commander-in-Chief.
And on this day, 1 week into the fight, determined to challenge critics of the U.S. war strategy.
We have an effective plan of battle and the flexibility to meet every challenge. Nothing will divert us from our clear mission.
This visit to Central Command headquarters was part pep talk, part rebuttal. The president taking the lead in taking on those who say the war plan underestimated Iraqi resistance and perhaps overestimated the battlefield advantages of technological superiority.
Day by day, Saddam Hussein is losing his grip on Iraq. Day by day, the Iraqi people are closer to freedom.
Of what happened in Baghdad has reached here, but for ground crew like this Staff Sergeant, the work will go on.
It's a high price to pay, but the outcome is what we're shooting for, and we're going to try and minimize that as much as possible with the smarter weapons and all of that, and hopefully we won't have too many more.
On the side of the F-16s, a record of what has already happened. Each symbol represents a mission on which bombs were successfully dropped. But pilots who fly them know mistakes can be made. Today, there were no guarantees. It can't happen again.
Well, geez, you can never say never. I mean, I will never say always. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's just a wartime. You have fog and friction. You have a lot of people that are that still live in this country that are under attack, and you know they've already proven that the Iraqis will put people that aren't a part of the conflict around strategic targets and then blame the whole thing on us. So there's always going to be some sort of something that happens that wasn't expected or you didn't want to happen. But I guarantee you that all of us, all the forces that are fighting, will try to eliminate that and try to stay away from that to the max extent.
The images that have come out of Baghdad today may have caused shock and even revulsion in some parts of the world, but here, tonight, nothing has changed. These aircraft will be leaving shortly, and some of them will be heading for Baghdad. And now their nighttime missions are already underway. Here, there is little time to pause for thought. Alistair Jackson in Kuwait.
Daylight bring out such a huge array of heavy armor in the middle of a war zone when quite clearly the opposing force has numerous air assets that can attack you. It's very, very confusing and unclear. There have been suggestions that perhaps